All right. All right, thanks for coming back. You could have run away. All right, this is my most recent book. Well, so technically I have one other book of essays, but this is my most recent big book. I was working on it for several years. I actually started in the very first weeks of COVID. Anyway, so this is another graphic novel. With immigration, one problem that I almost never have is getting people to care about the topic. Everyone in America has an opinion on immigration, practically. It's such an emotional topic. It is one that really defines people's views about the world. On the other hand, this is a topic where most people barely even think about it. Why write a book on it? This is one where I wanted to actually show people that it is a huge issue and you should totally care, which obviously is a hard sell, but I'm doing it anyway. Really, there's no point writing a book where everybody already agrees with you anyway. Right? You want to go and write a book where you have something new to say that's going to shock people, and if you're lucky, right? You definitely don't want to put people to sleep. So anyway, let's get started. All right, just some quick facts about housing prices. Right, so all of this is very closely based on the United States. If you go and look at other rich countries, the US seems to be about average. So what's happening in the United States is in general happening all over rich countries, and I've also got a lot of anecdotal evidence that it's happening in India as well, where you're getting large increases in housing prices, especially in desirable areas of the country. All right, so anyway, so over the last 50 years, there's a large increase of housing prices, much higher than inflation. In the United States, we had a lot of inflation in the last 4 years, and people often think of housing prices going up as just part of inflation. The point is that housing prices are rising more than inflation and by quite a lot. If we go back to an earlier era, go back to, let's see, from like 1890 to around 1980 or so, during this long period, the way that the world worked was that housing prices would sometimes go up because there's an increase in demand, and then they go back down. And they might go up again, they go back down, and roughly they stayed about flat for most of the data, and then suddenly they start going way up. There's also, you may notice, there's a giant spike. That is the housing bubble, and then things go back down, but important to understand, it also, by now it's gone back up again. So adjusted for inflation, it's now actually higher than its previous peak. So that's where we are. Okay. All right. So, and what was going on? So normally what happened in the past is that markets work the way that they work in textbooks. How do they work in textbooks? In textbooks, there's a short-run increase in demand, which raises prices. That means that prices are now above costs. And when prices are above costs, industry says, yum, yum, we can make free money here just by making the product and selling it at the high price for even though it doesn't cost us that much to make. When you get that kind of entry, that brings prices back down until finally prices and costs are brought back into harmony by entry. Right now in the US, it looks like housing prices are about double this break-even point. So housing prices, when you look about physically what does it really cost to make the house, including the raw value of the land, and then compare it to housing prices, on average for the US, prices are about double cost. In the most desirable parts of the country, like San Francisco, yeah, you have friends in the Bay Area? Anyone have friends in the Bay Area? Yes, all right. Well, then prices look like they could be 10 times cost. If you go out to very poor rural areas, West Virginia, then maybe they're just a cost and there's very little difference. But averaging over the whole country, about 2 times. And if the average is 2, then you know that some places are high, some places are low. All right. All right, so what happens? So supply and demand is the obvious story. Why do you have high prices? Demand's high, supply is low, and then obviously prices will be high, right? Right. Okay, so that is true, but it's very misleading because when you say, oh, it's just supply and demand, that makes it sound like it's just a fact of nature that things have to be this way. But the reality, as a lot of research has been showing over the last 20 years, is that the real problem is an artificial constriction of supply. Supply is low not because it's hard to make housing physically, but because it is hard to make housing legally. All right. And in particular, the regulations have gotten so strict that when demand goes up, often, like in a place like San Francisco, there's barely any response to supply. Instead, prices go up and they stay up. Here's a quick tour of housing regulations. This is actually a fairly accurate map of San Francisco. So if you're in a helicopter in San Francisco, this is about what you'll see. We've got skyscrapers in a small area of the peninsula, maybe 5 or 10% of the island. And then the rest of the city is like 2 or 3 stories tall. Right? Why does that building exist? Right? What's going on? Why is that building not 50 stories tall? Right? And the answer is that you are not allowed to turn San Francisco into anything other than what it is, except with extreme effort and luck and connections. And otherwise, it's going to stay what it is. Right? So these are the main housing regulations that matter in the United States. The regulations generally apply to other countries too, but usually the regulations that matter more or less vary from country to country. So these are the ones that matter, especially in the United States, and I'll give you an idea about how that might differ from Europe. And then I've already been talking to people about what's going on here. All right, so starting with one that actually you have in common with us, height restrictions. So I keep forgetting the letters, but the regulation you have on, if you want to double the height, you have to reduce the footprint. FSI. All right. Yes. Yes. All right. So the U.S. has very strict regulation of building heights. If you want to go and build a tall building, getting permission is very hard. It varies from hard to impossible. In San Francisco, it generally just is at the impossible level. There's about a 20-year period where 0 skyscrapers were built in San Francisco, despite very rapidly rising housing prices. And then they had a giant liberalization. They allowed 1 per year. All right, so that, and now they've actually had a change of regulations. It may go back down to 0 now. We'll have to see. All right. This is important because historically, it really was true that you could not have a lot of people living in the downtown of Paris, because in the pre-modern period, you could not safely build a building that was more than 2 or 3 stories tall, and therefore there was a physical limit on the number of people that could live walking distance from downtown Paris. If you've been to Italy, if you know the Leaning Tower of Pisa, that's what happens when you try to go and build something tall with pre-modern technology. And they actually have a lot of leaning towers in Italy, so you could do it. Like in early periods, you could do it, but not recommended because, and actually, they closed down Pisa for about a decade because one of those, a different leaning tower in Italy did collapse. All right, and they're like, mamma mia, no. So, all right, but anyway, now we do not have a problem with buildings just collapsing. We know how to do it. We know how to make them way taller than they were. Compared to the Burj Khalifa, the Leaning Tower of Pisa is nothing. Right? And so there no longer is really any physical limit on the number of people that can live walking distance from the world's most desirable locations. It does cost more to build the super tall buildings, but you could easily build up to 40 stories at actually fairly stable cost. All right. So we have the physical ability to go and take the most desirable places and just pack them with housing, and yet generally it can't be done legally. Something that is very unusual to the United States, at least compared to Europe, is Americans hate multifamily housing. So it is very hard to build apartments of any kind, to build townhomes of any kind. The general rule in America is that residential areas, you're only supposed to build a single family home, 1 home for 1 family. They can't have a common wall. That's evil. Europe is much more comfortable with apartments and things like that. All right. Then an additional thing that the United States does is we have the minimum lot size. So it's common, for example, that if you want to build a new home today, you have to have 1 acre of land per house. You guys know about acres, right? Yeah, all right. So yes, it is. It is. Builders normally will build as many homes as they can get permission for, and they will lobby as hard as they can to raise that number because people do like to have some extra land, but they are not willing to pay the price. People are generally not willing to pay a lot of money for all that extra land. It's something that if regulation was not there, builders would just build big mansions a few feet away from each other, and that's what the market actually will support. Because Americans will pay a lot of money to get a big house, but they will not pay a lot of money to get a lot of land. Like, we're not farmers, so, and like we barely do anything outside anyway. All right. So that's common. Another one that seems very minor, I didn't even think about when I started to write the book, but I read more about it and said like minimum parking requirements. Excuse me. If you want to build apartments in the United States, once you get permission for that, which is very hard, it's common to say you have to have 2 or 3 parking spaces per unit. When you multiply out all the land that you need for those parking lots, that is a drastic increase in cost. You could always do an underground parking garage. That's even more expensive, so the land has to be really valuable to justify an underground parking garage. And then, even more crazy, for commercial real estate, if you want to have a mall or stores, the normal parking law of the United States is if you want to have a business, you have to build enough parking spaces so that all of your customers will have them on the busiest day of the year if you charge 0. The busiest shopping day in the year of America is called Black Friday. It's the day after Thanksgiving. So basically, all of our parking is designed to make sure there's enough parking on that one day if you don't charge anything. It's free. Now, once they make you make all the spots, there's no point charging anymore. The result is that on the other 364 days of the year, almost every American commercial development has a vast array of empty spots. Parking spaces that could have been used to build more stores, to build mixed-use residences. Very valuable land, right? This would be land where you would be walking distance to major stores and yet generally totally illegal. Okay, and many more. We've also, like even in the United States, we got historic preservation. Europe, of course, they got crazy historic preservation. But Americans think we believe we have a history, right? Even though you might say, like, what history have you got? Right, but, and we can be crazy about that too. So New York City does have an historic parking garage. It's like, this is the original parking garage of America. Look at it. Let's have a field trip. All the children, behold, the first parking garage in America. It may seem to be a humble location, but this is the foundation of our whole society here. And that's why you can't tear it down and build condominiums. All right, let's see, there's a question there. Yeah.
Seems like real estate developers would have a serious concentrated benefit for achieving this. So
yes. Yes, that's a great question. So it's common among economists to go and say bad things about lobbyists. And the more I read about housing, the more I just say, you know what, it's thanks to lobbying from the construction industry that we even have houses. Because here's the thing. If you're in the oil industry, you actually have a reason to want to keep the price of oil high and to prevent entry. But the whole model of the construction industry is you build it and then sell it. And then how do you make more money? You've got to build another thing. So the construction industry, almost all their lobbying is actually just to go and get permission to build things. Why is it that it's so hard? The answer, as we're going to see, is that building things is very unpopular. Not, you say, well, like Americans say, I don't want anything ever built. Now, they don't say that. What they say is, of course, it'd be great if things were built as long as the following 1,000 conditions are met. And the conditions are so unreasonable that if you actually listen to these people, nothing would ever be built. The construction industry is basically there to be constantly pushing and trying to find someone. And is it corruption? What's corruption, right? Is it corruption to go and make friends with your local city councilman and take him out to dinner and support his campaign so that he goes and gives you the paperwork you need to go and make $1 million? Well, who knows? So let me just tell you a quick story. So in my neighborhood, there was an acre of land where the local government said, you cannot we will not connect you to the sewer lines, and you may not have a septic tank, and therefore you can't have a house. An acre of land, which if it got that paperwork, would be worth $1 million. I live in an expensive area, all right? And there was an owner of that land, and they just sat there suffering for decades, and finally, after about 15 years, they were given permission to put in a septic tank. How did that person do it? I don't know. But I strongly suspect that person was going and meeting local city council people and saying, come on, Like, this will be worth $1 million to me, please. Just what do I have to do? Just like, not corruption. I'm not going to bribe you, but tell me what I need to do to make you feel good about supporting this. And finally, a house was built there, right? But without that permission, it would just be a vacant lot enjoyed by no one. All right. Let's see. Was there one other question? Or okay. All right. Now, how do we know that it's regulation? Economists overwhelmingly agree that it is. So what is the evidence that's convinced them? I mean, partly, honestly, it's just going through and seeing how impossible it is to build anything, right? But the standard academic method is to do this. Step one, let's go and try to figure out what is the value of land that you can't build anything on. It has value greater than 0 because you could play cricket on that land, right? So you have some land, you can't build anything, but you can play a game, your kids can run. You could do a slip and slide. You have a slip and slide? You know what that is? Right, like it's like sprinklers and the kids can run and play. You can just say, you can have a picnic there. Right, what is the value of land like that? Right, so the original method is say, let's just go and compare houses that are otherwise similar, but one has a bit more land, but you can only build one structure there, so it's just some extra land. And from that, you say, okay, that is the value of land without a permit. All right, that's step one. Step two is you just go to a manual from the construction industry. I've actually checked out the manual and read it. It's like this thick. And it's like, okay, so how much is it going to cost to build every, you just put in exactly what you're going to do and you get a number. And then there's some regional adjustment because housing or construction costs are higher in New Jersey than in Florida or whatever. And then, so we got the value of the land, we got the cost of construction, we add those, and then we compare it to the price. And the standard way of measuring the cost of regulation, which economists call the zoning tax, is just to say regulation is the difference between those two things. It's the difference between the observed price and the actual physical cost minus permission. Minus permission. All right, so that's the idea. Now, there was some early work that used this method, and it just said, okay, we have enormous zoning taxes in San Francisco, in New York City, in Los Angeles, a few other places. But originally he said, but it's not a big deal for most of the country. Right, so it's still important, but not that important. Right, but more recent work actually got better data. And here, rather than looking at houses that had different amounts of land that were otherwise similar, they actually got data on vacant lots. And particularly, they got data on the exact location of those lots relative to the city center. So then what they were able to figure out was, what is the value of land that you can't build on as a function of its distance from the center? And from there, they were able to apply the same method. And then what they realized is almost every downtown area in America has a lot of regulation. Almost every downtown area, government is pushing prices higher. What varies is how quickly the regulation stops mattering or how quickly it matters less. So for example, in the city of Chicago, Chicago has very strict regulation in the immediate downtown. Now, if you go there, it's like there's a lot of skyscrapers. It's like, okay, like that shows that you're allowed to build something. But to know what regulation is doing, you have to say how many would be built if it were allowed. Now, by the way, so I actually have had a couple of Indians tell me that housing regulation doesn't matter in India. Yeah, yes, I know. Well, I agree with you guys. They're wrong. But their argument is basically, look, go to Mumbai, look at all the cranes. We're not stopping housing. It's like, you're not stopping all housing. I agree with that. But seeing a bunch of cranes, you have to know how many cranes would there be if the property owners could do whatever they wanted with their property. And that could be 3 times as much building. It could be 5 times as much building. You don't know, right? One of the people is to say, well, but we wouldn't want that much. So, okay, so at minimum, you're agreeing the regulation does matter, right? Let's at least agree on that point. Right, anyway, so the later work said that, it's like city of Chicago, very strong zoning in the downtown, but if you get 30 miles away from downtown Chicago, then prices are low again, and it doesn't seem like the regulation matters very much. On the other hand, Los Angeles. Los Angeles is basically a giant zoning plateau that goes out 50 miles in every direction from the city center, right? And then New York City is somewhere in the middle where there's still a lot of zoning 30 miles away, but it's definitely a lot less intense than in the immediate area of Manhattan. Right, so what does this mean? It means that while most of the physical area of the United States regulation isn't important, but most of the physical area of the United States is uninhabited. If you look at areas that people actually want to live, almost everywhere that people want to live actually does have a lot of regulation. Has anyone here ever driven across the United States? All right, so it's boring. It's really boring because most of America is completely empty, which goes back to like, why are Americans so afraid of immigration? By the way, so something I forgot to mention last class, but it's worth bringing up. So between the founding of the country and today, how many times did America's population multiply? So you start with the original population in 1789. Look at the population today. We multiplied how many times? Yeah, we're up to about 330.
Maybe 15 times?
Keep going. Yeah, what's that? Yeah, it's like 100 times. We multiplied the population 100-fold in about 200 years. All right. If you had told people in the 18th century that it was possible to multiply the population 100-fold, I think they just would have laughed at you. It's totally possible. How do we do it? Well, it couldn't have happened without much higher agricultural productivity. But once you had that, you're totally doable. And at this point, Americans think it's crazy to think that we could go and have immigration raise our population to 1 billion in 50 years. Like, it's only a tripling. What's the big deal? It's totally doable. Totally doable, right? All right. So you can say, all right, fine, regulation's terrible. It's raising the price of housing. But what's so great about housing? And the answer is, housing is one of the very largest items in people's budgets in the United States. So we could have very intense regulation of, say, chewing gum. We could be raising the price of chewing gum by a factor of 10, and all right, fine, who cares? It's just one product, hardly anybody uses it. On the other hand, if you take a product that is a large share of people's budgets and you double its cost, you are doing immense harm. Right? And really what you're doing is you're taking 20% of the budget, doubling the cost. So you say, if we could go and deregulate back to the normal system, this would mean that it would lower our cost of living by about 10%, all considered. And if you lower the cost of living by 10%, that's the same as raising your living standard by 11%, which is a very big deal. Yes?
Is this 10% and 11% across the US or just city centers?
Yeah, so no, that's it. So the doubling of the cost of housing, that is averaging over the whole US. Again, I'm rounding. And as you might guess, the estimates aren't perfect and different methods give you somewhat different answers. But yes, doubling, averaging over the whole US, and then some places way worse than doubling, and other places barely in effect at all, like rural areas. There you probably can get something that is very close to the cost of production. All right. So all this is good, but honestly, if this is all that I had to say, I would just figure, well, it's not enough for a book. What got me motivated to go and do this as a full book was realizing that there are many other problems that most people consider completely unrelated to housing that actually are very closely related to housing, and therefore we could go and simultaneously greatly mitigate many problems with one deregulation. Right. So one thing that people talked about is that when you go and raise the price of housing in the highest wage parts of the country, you discourage migration to those areas, which lowers total productivity of the US workforce. Yeah, so we're talking here about migration within India and how much higher the cost of living is. So yeah, you were saying that if you move from the poorest area of India to the richest area, a low-skilled worker can triple his income. And then you're saying after cost of living, then it's still like a doubling. Right, so anyway, the regulation in places like New York and San Francisco has gotten so bad that actually low-skilled workers get a lower standard of living if they go there. And it is better for a San Francisco janitor to just move to Mississippi because the housing is just so much cheaper. So you're paying most of your salary for a very tiny apartment in San Francisco. I guess.
Yeah. So assuming we got rid of this is a hypothetical. Mm-hmm. Let's say we got rid of most regulation, mm-hmm. nonsensical regulation mm-hmm. in all these city zones. Wouldn't that still increase the housing price dramatically? Because now the opportunity cost of a given plot of land has gone up that much more higher. So wouldn't that also result in higher prices for individual houses?
So no. I mean, the main thing is higher supply means lower prices. Here's the thing. So it might mean that you can sell out to a developer for a large price.
Yeah,
But
the
why does he pay you?
cost
But
of
he
land.
pays you so much because he's going to replace your one home with 100 homes. Right now, so so I think what you may be getting at is people often point out, and this is not wrong, that when you build new housing, usually you build nice new housing for rich people. All right, and so there's an idea of it's just going and making housing affordable for rich people. Who cares about them anyway? The key thing to understand is that all housing markets are connected. So when you build a luxury apartment building, where do the tenants come from? They come from other places. They come from other places that are not as nice. And then who occupies the place they were in? People from another place, and so on. So all these housing markets are connected. And really what you can see is, where do poor people live? They live in old housing. What would have happened if when that housing was built, someone had said it's just going to be for rich people anyway, there's no point of allowing it? Well, then that wouldn't exist. So if someone 50 years ago had been saying there's no point in allowing this, it's just for rich people, poor people today would not have that place to live. Yeah.
So let's assume you have a penthouse kind of a thing. You
Mhm.
have a villa in New York.
Mhm.
So now, let's say you're going to buy a villa in New York. It today may cost you $1 million, but let's say you got rid of all.
Try $50 million.
Okay,
yeah,
let's
yeah.
take 50.
Yeah.
So tomorrow you
yeah.
got rid of all regulation. Wouldn't the same villa now cost you like $200 million because of the opportunity cost? You can now build like more homes out of it.
So let's see. Again, no. I mean, like the whole point is that you can build, you build more stuff, and then how do you go and get people to move into your new thing? You have to offer them a better deal. That you have to offer them a better deal than they're currently getting. Yeah.
So is the janitor thing is true?
Uh,
Then why is not in the labor?
So, well, of course, people have. There's people. Yeah. Also people are attached to their locations. People don't want to go and lose all their family and friends. So yeah, basically, they're. Oh, sorry. Can we not have side conversations? So people are like. It is very normal that people do not do the highest income thing for themselves. There are some really horrible jobs that pay a lot of money, and people don't want to do those jobs, right? So,
But is there some that
yeah, yes. So it is generally true that if low skilled workers in the Bay Area would leave, they would get a higher living standard, but they would also be losing their friends and family, and so of course plenty have left. But then there's others like my mother's sick, she can't leave, she would never leave. I'll stay here, I'll have a lower income and take care of her. All right. So now, by the way, so here I do reference a paper that turned out to have terrible coding errors, and so we should just ignore the numbers. I went and did and tried to do a back of the envelope estimate, but anyway, but the general mechanism is true. It's just an issue of they screwed up.
but the new numbers make your case better.
No. So basically, I say the new numbers are lower, so it's not as big an effect as they were saying, but still definitely a notable effect in that direction. But anyway, so all this does point to a pretty straightforward way to get a big increase in living standards, and that's just deregulate this industry. But now here are a bunch of other things that will happen simultaneously and almost automatically as a result of allowing the industry to do its job. All right, first of all, inequality is going to go down. Social mobility is going to go up. Crime is going to go down. Birth rates are going to go up. We're going to actually have lower carbon emissions. I'm going to skip that poor prospects for working class males because it's so irrelevant to India. And I'll skip the political polarization too, but I'll do the other one, sorry. So housing regulation and inequality. Housing is what's called a necessity. That means that the share of your income you spend on housing falls as your income goes up. Rich people spend a smaller share of their income on housing than poor people. What happens then if you artificially inflate the cost of housing? You make rich and poor worse off, but you make the poor more worse off than you make the rich. Deregulation does the opposite, which means that inequality does come down. Right? And of course, also owners are richer than renters. We're going to be talking a little bit about the idea that renters benefit from deregulation, but owners lose. The correct story I'm going to try to convince you is renters definitely gain from deregulation, and for homeowners, it's mixed. Right? So it's not a definite loss for homeowners, but for renters, totally unambiguously good. Right? And yes, owners are richer than tenants. So again, you are reducing inequality by reducing housing prices. Now here is a less obvious one. So who's heard of Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century? Big international bestseller, read by hardly anybody, but definitely sold a lot of copies. All right. So the whole theme of the book is that inequality is built, rising inequality is built into capitalism because interest rates are higher than growth rates, and therefore all any rich person needs to do to get richer and richer and richer is just sort of sit on their money and let it accumulate. All right, it's gotten a lot of criticism, but the criticism that is relevant today is there's an economist named Ronley who went and said, well, what is actually measured in capital? What's included in there? Because a lot of people talk about different measures and saying this thing's terrible, this is happening. They never even look at the definition of the variable. And it's good to look at the definition of the variable. Right? And what he noticed is, yeah, housing is included as capital. Huh, that's interesting. All right, what happens if we just go and disaggregate non-housing capital from housing capital? And he found that actually from the US, and as well as a bunch of other countries, the real story of the post-war era is not capital is accumulating a larger and larger share of income. Rather, capital is, like as we normally think about it, like industry. That has a very flat income share. And really what's gaining is just housing. Right? So like the real story of the rise of the rising share of capital, it's not that anyone who owns a business, anyone with financial wealth just gets richer and richer and richer automatically. So these are net capital shares. There's net capital shares, so you're basically taking all income and then summing them. And then dividing it by total income. Yeah, it's a macroeconomic measure. Okay, so anyway, the real story is not that capitalists are just accumulating more and more and more. Rather, the story is that some lucky people in San Francisco bought cheap homes in 1970, and then their government strangled the supply, and then the dot-com boom happened and made that an incredibly desirable area to live in. And so rather than it being capitalism naturally leads to inequality, its regulation is artificially causing a whole lot of inequality. Now, similarly, yes?
Was there any specific event, like let's say a fire or something, that caused a sudden spike in housing regulation? Or did it just sort of happen?
Right. So yes, that's a great question. Actually, very often the truth is that there's regulation on the books, and it barely matters as long as demand is flat. As long as population's stable, you can make it really hard to build anything new, and it's like, all right, well, we don't really want to build anything new. But I mean, like really what happens is that you get like a tech boom in an area, and then market forces would normally go and build a lot more housing, and then the regulation suddenly kicks in. Right, so I think that I think it is true that regulation has gotten stricter over time. A lot of it is actually the application of the regulation rather than the law. So, like often there'll be a board which has always been allowed to decide what to do, but in the past the board would say, yeah, okay, fine, that's all right. And then over time they get to be more and more, well, like we're going to need an environmental impact statement. We're going to need further consideration. We need 6 months to weigh this. All right, now on social mobility, how is yes. Yes.
I just want to get your view on Georgists who believe
the Georgists. All right.
They wouldn't necessarily add value by just owning it. And if we tax them, they have an incentive to let go of that piece of land and add to the supply of land that is accessible in the market.
Let's see. So, let me just give you my general take on Georgism. So, who here has even heard of Henry George? All right. Henry George was the best-selling economist of the 19th century in the United States. He sold more books than anyone else. His famous book is Progress and Poverty, and basically he was a guy with one big idea. Let's get rid of all their taxes and just tax land. Right? And he specifically said, don't tax the structure, just tax the raw value of the land. Because that's something where you don't even do anything to create it, so it's not going to cause any disincentive effects. He said if you tax the structure, people might build less. But if you just tax the land itself, then you won't. And then there's also this argument saying that this encourages people to not hold vacant land. Right? Okay. All right. Anyway, so what do I think about that? I actually do have a paper on this, which got some Georgists angry. But first of all, I said, look, there's something deeply wrong with the story because think about oil. Suppose you got a lot of oil under your land. What would Henry George say to do? You're assessed at a very high value because it has all that oil under. So Henry George would say what?
High tax.
Yeah, high tax. All right. So and why and high tax because you didn't do anything to put that oil there. The oil was always there. You just own it. All right. But if you did that, what would happen to the incentive to find more oil? Yes.
Avoid looking.
Yes. Then then it does. Like if it was a true Georgist 100% tax and it was strictly enforced, there would no longer be any reason to look for minerals anymore or natural resources anymore. Yes.
Or to disclose. that.
Yes. Or well, yes. So.
Then why? You still want to sell that.
So the key thing is with that Georgist tax, it is high value, but the government takes 100%. So basically, suppose that you go and you find land with oil. What will happen is the government will then, as soon as they if you are following George strictly, the government will find out, and then they will say, okay, the land's worth $1 billion. Great, we're going to impose $1 billion tax on it. Let's have an auction. And you get the $1 billion, and then the government says, now your tax bill is $1 billion, give me all the money. Right. There is a paper which I saw, and I've been having trouble tracking it down, but I definitely saw the paper, saying that countries where the government has a finders keepers rule for mineral resources seem to have a lot more minerals. And it's like, it's like, all right, so there's a few stories, but the obvious story is not that the obvious story is that when you know that that if you find it, you can keep it, you are much more likely to look, and when you look, you are more likely to find. All right. So now, I'd say this is basically totally ignored by Georgists, and it's a reasonable point. That's like, okay, so if there is some kind of mineral resource in the land, that is actually one where markets give an incentive to find it. That is a valuable incentive to give, and the tax would actually mess up a very important industry. You might say, okay, well, that's just one very small kind of land value. Okay, or is it? So here's another story. My friend Steve Kuhn, Austin financier, founder of Major League Pickleball, during COVID, he decided he wanted to start a pro-immigration theme park. He really did. And so he bought about 100 acres of land out in Dripping Springs, Texas, and you can go there. And if he's around, he would love to meet all of you. He's got a big picture from My Open Borders on display at the park. He's got all kinds of pro-immigration posters and things. He's got pickleball. He's got miniature golf. He's got live music. And he built this thing. All right. Before he got there, the value of the land was very low, and it was basically just a farm town. Maybe it was going to become a place for commuters, but basically the town. Very little was going on in the town. His theme park put Dripping Springs on the map. As a result of him moving there, land prices in Dripping Springs have dramatically increased. And most of the money that he's made on that theme park is actually the rise in the value of the 100 acres that he bought. It's not clear the business actually is profitable. But when you count how he made Dripping Springs cool, and now hipsters and programmers and other rich people want to live there, he added enormous value. You might say, well, like, how is that like finding oil? Say, it's a lot like finding oil. My friend Steve Kuhn saw a farm town, and he was looking around for business opportunities. He said, you know what I could do with that 100 acres? I could turn it into a pickleball, miniature golf, live music, pro-immigration theme park. And if you were to go and tax away all of that rising value of that land, that would take away almost all that incentive. And I say a lot of what's going on with real estate developers is they are actually creating value that was not there, or you could say they are finding value that no one else noticed. This is really underappreciated. So you might say, well, any idiot could have seen that. Well, then why didn't any idiot see it? Why was it my friend who saw it and did it and not somebody else? It's always easy after somebody does it to say, well, I could have done that. But, well, you didn't. So it's like, I could have found that oil if I was just looking around. Well, you didn't. So I'd say that this is a big problem with Georgism, is they are ignoring the creativity of the person that finds and develops land.
I don't mean to defend the Georgists. Just trying to understand.
Yeah.
How
Well, I mean, there's worse people in the world.
But I'm just trying to think from what Georgists would say here, and maybe that's a technicality I don't fully understand. But in the example of the theme park, probably there is a land value attached to it, and there is the commerce and the ticketing and the number of people who came in and brought the sales coming in. I'm sure they are closely related, one affects the other, but
Yeah, like the actual theme park, I think, is barely breaking even. It's like almost, but pretty much 100% of the profits comes from the rising land value, right? And here's the thing: is he didn't just raise his own land value; he raised the value of the whole town, right? So there's one where, if anything, you should say he should be getting a subsidy from the rest of the town because of what he did for the whole town. So anyway, I should move on, and then let's so I mean, like, it's hard to resist a digression into Georgism. Let me just hold questions, then we'll have some more at the end. All right, so now there's another paper by two famous economists, Ganong and Shoag, and their big result is that the United States used to have very high regional income convergence. That meant that rich areas of the country were getting higher population growth, poor areas were getting lower population growth, and as a result, there was an equalization of income throughout the US. So over on the left, that's showing on the x-axis, that's log income per capita in 1940, and then on the y-axis, that's showing population growth. This is a low immigration period in the US, so almost all population growth is either babies or internal migrants. All right, so, and every one of these is a state. So you can see basically we've got these high income states are the ones that are gaining a lot of population, and actually the lowest income ones are actually losing population during this time. That's 1940, 1960. Fast forward to 1990, 2010. Notice the slope's actually negative. People are moving away from the rich states to the poor states. All right, so that's weird, right? So things are not that bad in India yet, right? That is how bad things have gotten. Now, what's the connection to housing? Well, they looked closely and said, high-skilled workers are still moving in the traditional manner. High-skilled workers still move from poor states to rich states because the cost of the housing is a smaller share of their budget, and since their absolute wage is higher, the higher wage more than makes up for the cost of housing. But the low-skilled workers, on the other hand, the opposite is true. Low-skilled workers have a higher standard of living in poorer places, and they are leaving. All right, so here's what they show. So this first block here just shows the nominal income and net migration of the unskilled. So here we see they got this negative slope for the unskilled. For the skilled, it's still positive. But here they switch to income minus housing costs. So the net gain you get from moving. And there you'll see for the unskilled, let's see, hold on. So yeah, so now for both groups, when you're looking at wages minus housing, then they both have the correct positive slope. Everybody is moving to places where their standard of living is higher, but it's just that housing costs have gotten so high in rich areas that it is better for a poor person to leave a high wage area. Oh, sorry, short question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm just going to ask, in these trends, are there any major differences after COVID with remote work?
So this only goes to 2010. Quick version of what happened during COVID. I started writing this book during COVID, and I did have an editor say, well, I mean, COVID has sort of ended high housing prices in America, so maybe there's not even any reason for this book. And I just say, all right, COVID led to housing price falls in San Francisco and Manhattan, that's true. But guess what happened to overall housing prices in America? Overall, they went up even higher because those people in San Francisco and Manhattan moved to other places. So the whole country got even more expensive. So the basic result is that COVID did not fundamentally change anything. It just, there's a slight shift from basically rich people no longer wanted to live in fancy cities because fancy cities were actually suddenly the place with the least fun. And the most fun was actually to leave a city where you could at least still live your life. All right, let's see. So housing regulation and crime. All right, let's see. We're still good on time. All right. Here is a weird thing about the United States. If you go to major cities, you will see a lot of vacant lots. I think something like 15% of urban land in the US is just vacant. This is normally very valuable land, so why aren't they building anything? Well, given the talk, you probably know what I'm going to say, right? So they could be speculating, like Henry George said, or it could be that you cannot get the 17 pieces of paper that allow you to go and put something there. It is very standard that vacant lots are centers for urban crime. Like gangs will go and operate on a vacant lot. All right? You can even see them there. There they are, hanging out on the vacant lot. So anyway, there's some researchers who said maybe this is causal. Maybe vacant lots literally cause crime and it's not a coincidence. And they got the city of Philadelphia to let them randomly beautify half of the vacant lots in the city of Philadelphia. So basically, the city of Philadelphia is fine, that we'll let you. So they randomly picked half of the different vacant lots in the city, and the ones they picked, they went and cleaned up the garbage. So you might have noticed a little garbage in some parts of India, right? Yes. All right. So cleaned up the garbage, planted grass, planted some trees, put in some benches, and put a little fence around the vacant lot. And then they went and measured crime. And what they saw was that in the areas that were in neighborhoods around the cleaned up vacant lots, the police reported crime, that's going to be your more serious crime, that fell by 9%. And then when they actually, perceptions of crime, like how much crime do you think is going on, then that fell by a lot more, like 37%. As to which measure is better, it's hard to say. I mean, part of what's going on is that in high crime areas, most crime does not get reported, right? I believe that's true in India, right? So, yes. So, like, general thing to understand is when you're comparing crime between countries, always start with murder, because murder normally gets reported. Excuse me. All right. All right. Now, what's really interesting about this piece, and the reason why I wanted to talk about it in my housing book, is if you read through the whole article, there's a paragraph where they say, look, we are not talking about building anything. We're opposed to gentrification. We're good human beings. We don't want any new construction. All we want to do is plant some grass. That's what they said. And when I'm reading it, I'm like, well, if just planting grass has such a good effect on crime, how about putting an apartment building there? Don't you think that would be even better? And yeah. So they were worried about this popular opposition to building anything, but it does make great sense that if some grass is a deterrent, surely actually having an occupied apartment building would be better, right? And why are there so many vacant lots in high-priced cities? It's almost certainly regulation, right? And now this is one on the environment, specifically on carbon emissions, right? So this is from a paper by Glazer and Kahn, and what they did is it's really an accounting paper, where they just did all this accounting, like all the different sources of carbon emissions and added them all up from every possible source, and then went and analyzed what the results were. So one big result is that despite a lot of like back to nature, we should live in the countryside, green ideology, actually central cities have lower emissions per person than non-cities. Because basically, especially like an apartment building, you're sharing walls with other people, and so you are not losing as much heating and cooling. All right. Another result is that the area of the country that has the best climate for emissions is California, where basically it's got a nice climate, so you don't do a lot of heating and you don't do a lot of air conditioning. On the other hand, the South is the worst. So the American South, which honestly it has weather quite a bit like India, right? But anyway, so they have like so much air conditioning they're using, and they also do have some cold. So the winters are a bit colder, so they're using that. Anyway, that's a lot. Northeast is in between. They also find that new homes, even though they are bigger than old homes, are actually greener because they use much better insulation, much better materials. And then finally, the big result of the paper is that the areas where environmentalists should want the whole country to live have the most housing regulation and have done the most to make housing really expensive, so people live in other places. So like I am from California. I will say Californians are the most self-righteous Americans in the country. They just think they're so much better than everybody else. And like, oh, we're protecting the environment, but we're not going to let anyone go and build things here. It's like, well, you understand what happens when people cannot afford to live in California? They don't move to Mars. They move to other parts of the country where they have higher heating and cooling bills, and where they use more energy and have higher carbon emissions. So the punchline of the work is that there are truly perverse regulations in the United States, where the least regulated areas are the areas where it's easiest to build. The least regulated areas are the areas where carbon emissions are highest. The most regulated areas are the areas where carbon emissions are the lowest.
But doesn't larger houses or more construction lead to more the carbon?
Well, the key thing is that if you're worried about carbon emissions, it is a problem for the planet. It's global warming. So it's true that there would be more emissions in California if you let more people there, but the net effect for the planet is lower because those people are moving from higher emission states to lower emission states. All right, and let's see, other problems. Yes.
So on your slide of for vacant plots.
Oh, for the vacant plots?
Yeah, the previous slide.
Hmm?
So there is a research paper which is written by Sahil Gandhi in India.
Mm-hmm.
He says that there is something called as housing vacancy paradox that exists in India,
Mhm.
wherein despite like in cities like Mumbai, despite there being high housing crisis,
Mhm.
plots are still vacant.
Mhm.
Apartments are still vacant because the house owners, they are scared that if they rent it out,
Mm.
there is the tenants basically would
Yeah.
occupy
Yeah,
the
occupy
space.
it.
And
Mhm.
so he says that because of weaker regulations and because of weaker institutions in the country,
Mhm.
this is happening.
Hmm.
So if
So how is that weaker regulations rather than weaker property rights?
yeah,
I mean, it isn't really the regulations take the side of the tenants, and
so
Yep.
he mentions that, so according to his research, he says that if these institutions were strengthened, around like 20% would be 20% of housing crisis could have been solved.
yeah, that's possible. So I mean, I was in Spain for a month this summer, and there they actually have what they call the Ocupa law, which says that under certain circumstances, a person who is renting the place can just say, "I have nowhere else to go. I get to live here rent free forever." And it's even been tried in some hotels, although normally you can't get away with it in a hotel. All right. Okay, so low birth rates. So I understand that Indians are starting to get worried about low birth rates. All right, a little bit. Yeah. So actually, 12 years ago, I bet a colleague about Indian birth rates. So 12 years ago, I said that India's birth rates would be below 2, or total fertility rate would be below 2.0 by 2032. Looks like I'm going to crush him.
You've already won it.
Yeah. Yes.
I think you've already won.
Yeah. So we're like I said, we're real. I looked at the numbers. We're real close. We're real close. All right. Right. Anyway, so now I actually think that India's population is one of your greatest strengths, and that blaming underdevelopment on high population is totally wrong. But I always bet on what I think will happen, not what should happen. So I just said, look, the fertility is going way down. Every other country is going way down. I think India will go way down too. And my friend said, no, you don't understand the culture of India. They will just keep having babies no matter what. So, all right. Anyway, but United States people are actually starting to worry a bit. And there are multiple papers. So I think honestly, the most convincing argument is just this. In the United States and in most Western countries, people are not comfortable getting married while they live with their parents. I've heard in India the norm is weaker, and you might be okay with that. But, all right, so anyway, and especially people in first world countries are not comfortable having kids while they live with their parents. All right, and what is one of the main reasons why people keep living with their parents? Because it's too expensive to get their own place. So I think that's pretty reasonable. All right, that's the despair one. We can talk about that later, but it's so specific to America that it's hard for me to see you caring much. All right. Now, here's the big question. Right? If we can actually go and greatly reduce so many problems simultaneously by just going and freeing up the housing market, why do we have so much regulation? Right. So here is my general answer. I know economists love to go and find some small minority to blame democratic policies on. I think that is usually wrong. And basically the only policies that I think normally you should blame on a small minority are the most boring policies. If it's so boring that no one even knows about the policy except for 3 people, probably those 3 people are involved. But as a policy that anyone can talk about on television, my view is that normally that policy actually has a lot of popular support. Right? So here's what I will say, both from public opinion, but also from talking to a lot of Americans. People support housing regulation because they think the country would be worse without it. They think life would be worse, and the regulation is, on balance, a good thing. Right? And furthermore, when we go to public opinion, renters support regulation too. It's not just homeowners saying, I've got to strangle this market to protect the value of my home. People who are renting also will say, like, I don't want a bunch of greedy developers just building stuff. That is a normal reaction of human beings to deregulating housing. Is like, so there'll just be people getting rich making housing, and that's okay. No, not in our town. right, now, what are standard complaints? Standard complaints, what would be so bad about building new housing? Well, it's like we'll have more traffic, we'll have more parking problems. There's also like, if the schools will be overcrowded. Another one is we need to protect the character of the neighborhood. This is a neighborhood of lovely 2-story Victorian homes in San Francisco, and it should remain exactly that forever. And then a last one is just preventing conflicting uses. We don't want to have a pig farm next to a mansion. Actually, could we hold the question till, so just wait? Okay. So these are all, so we got all these complaints, and I'll say, all right, well, so a lot of these complaints, there's something to it, but it doesn't really explain why we have housing regulation. Why? Well, look, for traffic and parking, there is a really simple and totally technologically feasible alternative to strangling housing, and that is to charge people on their app to drive and park, and to adjust the prices based upon traffic conditions. And God, do you need that here? You really need that very badly here. All right. This is something where I have never met an economist who disagrees with this. Why do we have horrible congestion at predictable times of day on the roads? Because the price is the same all day long, namely zero. If you would go and charge something. So I noticed my driver today, I think he paid 30 rupees to park for an hour. That seemed to be a high enough price to make it easy to park there. He didn't have any trouble. The parking lot had plenty of extra spaces. All right, so you don't even need to have a large charge to greatly reduce the amount of traffic. Just like anything would actually probably make a big difference. And I'll say there's actually a lot of Americans who would also not drive if you charge them 30 rupees. Like Americans like can't pay for parking. It's a sin, right? It's a sin to have to pay for it. Now, of course, the standard reaction here is, oh, so then only the rich people will be able to drive, only rich people will be able to park. It's like, that's better than only rich people can have a house. And the double standard here where it's fine for houses to cost $1 million, but it's a sin to charge someone $2 to drive to work. This is the mentality. It's like, and so because we built more houses, people would be driving, that would cause congestion. Let's stop the houses to make sure the roads can be driven on. It's like, how about we do the much cheaper thing that does not actually cause anywhere near the harm, right? And it is a hard sell. People around the world do not like tolls on roads. They do not like being charged for parking. And yet, if there is scarcity, then it is actually better. You get a better experience. The road is actually drivable. You can actually say, look, I may have to pay extra to drive at this time, but I know I can do it. I don't have to worry, will it take 2 hours to cross Delhi? I'll just pay the price, which can be very easily adjusted. And again, with smartphones, it is really easy to do it now. The technology is totally here. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, so pricing intercity roads in India is fairly common.
So do you have it in Delhi?
No, between cities.
Oh yeah, intercity. But yes, I know because we were on one in Agra, and that was the best road I was ever on in India, and by a lot. Yeah. So, of course, there you are pricing the roads where probably actually there wouldn't be that much traffic even without the toll. And on the other hand, the places where you have horrible congestion, there it's free.
One addition to the standard complaint. 6 years ago, we did a closed door meeting, and in one of India's top finance journalists was in the room, and she was opposed to the idea of deregulation, because it will increase the supply. I have recently bought a house, it will increase my mortgage value, and therefore, please do not decrease the
So
house.
that argument it exists, and some people actually make it. Probably more people think it than make it, because you sound like a jerk when you say it.
She was making it.
Yes, although not on television, you may notice. But actually, so that argument is sometimes true, but I'm going to still say it's actually quite overstated for some non-obvious reasons. All right, so first point, gratis is not great. Making scarce stuff free is actually bad, and it leads people to go and adopt other bad policies which cause a lot of harm. And the best thing to do is you're worried about traffic and parking, just charge for traffic and parking and let people build what they want. Same thing for schools being overcrowded. It's like, well, why is this a problem? Oh, because taxpayers are paying $15,000 a year per student. Well, maybe you shouldn't pay that much money per student, right? Or alternately, how about you go and let people build and charge them a higher property tax rate for the new construction? Yesterday, well, I'm forgetting his name, but there was one person there at Trustbridge who had written his dissertation, and he was there to give the comments. And he said, "No, Brian, you're totally wrong, because assuming that that everyone pays the same property tax, actually the cost of letting in a family with children is a net burden." And I said, "Okay, well, who said you have to charge everyone the same property tax?" He's like, well, you can't, like the model, you don't have to charge everyone the same property tax. And it would make a lot of sense to say yes to new construction, but higher property tax if that's really the problem. Right, now, another thing, a lot of the early zoning regulations, specifically for separation of uses, say we don't want pig farms near mansions. We're going to separate residences from commercial, from industrial. But there is a famous book called Land Use Without Zoning about Houston, where the author says, look, market forces give you natural separation anyway. Why? Well, where do you want to put industry? Next to railroads and docks. You don't want to go and put a big factory in the middle of a residential area. Like, that is not good for business, right? Similarly, where do you go and want to put your store? You want to put it on a main road where you had a lot of drive-by traffic. Where do you want to go and put nice houses? You want to put them next to other nice houses because rich people appreciate rich people more than poor people do, and so on. And yes, so I actually was checking the modern map of Houston, and he's totally right. You look at the docks and you'll just see tons of industry. Look at train lines, tons of industry. So now people say, but it's not perfect, and that's true. The problem with regulation is it's too perfect, because it means we can't have a gas station within 10 miles of a mansion. You need to have some gas stations near the mansions. It does not make sense to make the separation so strong. So in the U.S. especially, it is very hard to do what's called mixed-use development, where you have stores on the bottom and residences on the top. Most places say evil, can't be done. We need to have the stores in one place, the residences in another. And then people complain about parking and driving. Look, if people could live next to stores, they might not even need cars.
So is this the transition with which we are more afraid of in terms of policy? Because I mean, the arguments that you're making, they are quite simple, and they're quite simple, in my view. But then people are still afraid of the change. So is it the transitionary period that
so I'm just about to get to that.
Okay.
So my general view of public opinion is you can never be too simple when you're explaining public opinion. Public opinion is not sophisticated. Public opinion is extremely emotional, based upon the most superficial reactions that people have. All right, this is something that I like to tell Europeans. Historical value is largely included in market price. There are many people who like historic homes, and they will pay extra for them. There are tourists who like historic buildings, and a business can go and charge them extra to go and visit an historic building. And I say, and if your building still does not pass the market test, then yeah, why don't we go and replace it with something else? All right, so really, why not? Now, this protecting property value story, economists love it. They love the idea of people are voting on the basis of their objective self-interest. It may be inefficient, but at least it makes sense. Stop, oh wait. Okay, all right, so first thing, this story is grossly overrated. It's not always wrong, but there's a bunch of obvious problems with it. First of all, if it's really just protecting property values, why can't we go and do a deal like you can go and bring it in if you pay a higher property tax, and then we'll cut the property taxes of the existing people? Or we will say you can go and build retirement housing because you have no kids, and so that will not burden the schools. Or you can go and bring in commercial development because commercial stores have no children. So, and yet still those kinds of construction are still heavily regulated. So yes, why is it so hard to get a deal? Think about this. If you are dealing with a totally greedy person, would they ever say no to one of your requests? Say, hey, would you give me a ride to Agra today? Would a greedy person just say, absolutely not, leave me alone? What a greedy person would say is, well, at what price? How much money are we talking? And they might offer a very high price. what is striking about this regulation is there's generally no way to buy your way out of it. You might say, yeah, that's the way almost all regulation is, legally. Yeah, exactly. Right, so a true story of Alex Tabarrok. You guys know Alex Tabarrok?
Yes.
All right. The first time he tried to come to India, he failed because he didn't know you had visas. All right, so what happened is he first flew to Turkey, and actually when he got to Turkey, he says, oh, sir, you need a visa to enter Turkey. He's like, oh, I forgot. And they said, no problem. We got visa on arrival, pay us $50, you're welcome to Turkey. All right, and then he said, okay, but now you're gonna need your visa to India. He said, okay, so what do I pay for that? You're just gonna have to go home. There is no hope, there's no way you're gonna get your visa. Now maybe you could get away with the e-visa. But notice, India did not have an option of saying, oh, you're gonna have to get the special platinum late visa. That costs $1,000 US. And guess what? If you had asked for that money from Alex, he totally would have paid it because he was already in Turkey. And on top of everything else and not missing the trip, it was also pretty humiliating to go home to his wife and say, like, yeah, I didn't think about the visa. And so it was hugely embarrassing for him. He would have gladly paid that money if it was allowed, but it was not allowed. Right, and notice Indian corruption did not save him. There was no one at the Indian visa office who said, sir, there's no possible way that we could give you the visa now. I mean, it's not like you could just give me $1,000 US and then everything would be fine, right? The law was enforced, and the law was idiotic and just caused harm to him for no reason, and that's the way that most regulation works. Corruption often is a good thing. It's a way of getting around a crazy law, right? Let's make a deal is the motto of every greedy person. It is not, no, absolutely not. I would never allow it. I would rather die. And yet that is the way that most regulations are actually written. Actually, let's just hold it for a little. We're almost done, and then we'll do it. All right. Now, how could an owner possibly gain from deregulation which reduces housing prices? Most people say, yeah, like there's no possible way. Yeah, actually, there are a bunch of possible ways. What if you want to upgrade to a better home? Suppose you are in what we call a starter home. It's your first home. You've had a few kids. You want a better home. Do you want housing prices in your area to double? You don't, because yes, you get to sell your existing home for double the price. You also have to buy the new home for double the price. It is actually bad for an existing homeowner who wants to upgrade to have housing prices be high. Another one, what if you have adult children and you would like them to live near you? What do you think happens in San Francisco? Right, someone goes and buys a home very cheap in 1970, and now they want their kids to get their own home. How are they going to afford that home? It's like $5 million a house. So that means that either your kid will live 100 miles away, or you will take a loan out of the value of your house to give your kid the money to buy the house. What a system, right? Or of course, how about selling out to a developer? That is a great way to make a pile of money off your home. I'll just sell out to a developer. So and then you're like, well, then I will take that money, I will go live someplace else, and then my home will be replaced with 100 or 1,000 homes. And again, if we just go and try to apply the story, remember, renters generally support regulation too. And if you look further, there are many other false predictions of the self-interested theory, like people would be super happy to get business development, business real estate. Because remember, business real estate in America, they pay the normal property tax rate, but businesses use almost no services. So letting in a business is almost a free lunch from the point of view of local government. This is part of the reason why local governments will try to give special tax breaks to business. But if there's real competition, it wouldn't just be some tax breaks. They basically barely have to pay anything. And in general, the public reaction to these tax breaks is that's not fair. They should pay the same tax rates as everybody else. That's not what a greedy person says. A greedy person does not say you should have to pay the same rate regardless of the profitability of it. It's like, oh, the cost is low. Well, I'd be delighted to give you a discount. That is what a shrewd business person does, is they consider, well, since the cost is lower, I will give you a discount in order to match the possible competition. All right, so what are my preferred stories about what's really going on? Right now, by the way, my first book is The Myth of the Rational Voter, so I have a general objection to any story saying that voters are very clever and have figured out the world and are voting to advance their objective self-interest. I say it's almost the opposite model is right. Voting is highly emotional, ideological, it's based upon group identity, it has very little to do with anything that is actually in the real world. It's rather just, it's like a very poor philosophy paper. Just imagine like a really badly written philosophy paper. That's what an election is. Right now, what aren't their special interests? Yeah, they're there changing the small details, which are worth billions of dollars sometimes, but stuff that normal people don't care about. It's like, what's really going on with support for housing regulation? So a big part of the story is just total economic illiteracy. There are a couple of papers showing that if you just ask Americans what would happen to housing prices if you built a lot more housing, well, about a third say prices would go down, about a third say no effect, about a third say prices would go up. So if that's what people think, then I understand why they don't want housing deregulation. Like, what's the point? It's not going to make anything any cheaper anyway. There's also a very cool paper where they actually asked Americans, should we approve this development? But all they did was half of them were told the developer will make a big profit, and the other half were not told that. Just hearing the developer make a big profit just crashed support by like 20 or 30 percentage points. Now, it is just an idea of like greedy business people sucking us dry. They're totally evil. I hate them. It's like, do you feel that way about farmers? Are you angry about the people that feed you? Well, why are you angry at the people that house you? Like why are they terrible? Like, why do you think they're terrible people? What is the problem with them? But they still have these very negative views. Right? Another one is what I call a status quo bias. You've heard of status quo bias? Everything is fine right now, right? The worst thing would be any change. India's perfect just the way it is, right? America's perfect just the way it is. And it's like, well, if people always thought that, then there'd be no improvement. Thank God that people realize that things can be improved, and it is, in fact, often there are things where it's easy to improve them, like let's get electronic road pricing for the cities of India, right? Very important, right? But the reaction of a lot of people to any proposal for development is we shouldn't change a thing. It's like, well, the people in New York City generally think that their skyscrapers are one of the best things about the city, and people pay a lot of money to have a view of those skyscrapers. So why do you think that it'd be so terrible to go and tear down some old Victorian homes in San Francisco and build some new skyscrapers? It's not the same. Or maybe it's exactly the same, and we should just go full speed ahead. All right. In my book, I actually have a discussion with Ed Glazer about historic preservation. And I show him, in the book, I have a time machine. I have a time machine. And we go back to 1931, and I show him the original Waldorf Astoria Hotel of Manhattan. It's a gorgeous building, and it was torn down that year because there was almost no regulation at the time. I can make more money, do it with a new building, tear down the old building, build a new building. It's my land. I do what I want. Right? And most people, if you look at that building, I think you will say, probably they shouldn't have torn it down. And then what did they build to replace it? The Empire State Building, one of the most iconic buildings in the history of humanity. All right, and if you would listen to people and just said, look, this is beautiful, we should never change it. Well, why do you assume that we're going to tear it down to build something worse? Maybe we're going to tear it down to build something even better. All right, so I call this the history of the future. Every historic building was generally built in a place that previously had something older there, something that had to be torn down. Usually we don't even know what it was, but you can bet the people at the time were disappointed. It's like, how could you tear down this wonderful thing? All right. Another big factor, I say, is just sheer numeracy, just not putting numbers on things. There's a great book called Neighborhood Defenders. The authors got transcripts of almost every land use meeting in the state of Massachusetts. What do people even say at these meetings? It's almost 100% complaining. And the complaints are almost never, it's going to hurt property values. The complaints are much more about things like there's a nest of birds. Where will the birds go? And it's like one nest of birds. This is a $50 million project and there's 3 birds. So who cares? Right? And yet, yes, you're never going to win with that. You got to say, we have considered the birds. It's a really important issue. And we are prepared to build an entire bird park for them at the cost of $1 million. And then people say, that's not good enough. Birds, these are natural birds. They should be able to stay in their natural location, untouched by man. And you're ruining that. And this is very standard. The complaints are ones where you could say, even if you're totally right, who cares? You're trying to stop a $1 billion project with a $10 complaint. And right, so this is an example after I finished the book. So I have a friend who's a professor at the University of Wyoming. This is a beautiful area of rural America, and they live in the college town. There was a developer who had a vacant lot. He wanted to build 30 homes. The neighbors were outraged. They came to the meeting and couldn't even imagine what they would say. They had a complaint I've never heard before. Light pollution. Light pollution. We love looking at the stars. Every night we go out and we say, oh, the beautiful stars of Wyoming. Like liars. They probably yeah, well, once every 10 years they look up, oh yeah, we got stars, great. Right. But anyway, they came there and they said, we cannot build these. The light pollution will block our view. And no one just said, if you like the stars so much, walk another 10 minutes and you'll be fine. What's the big deal? Right? But so they complained, and finally they said no homes should be built. Then finally they reached a compromise, 23 homes. So they destroyed 7 homes over this ridiculous complaint. Right? And that's most of what's going on with the regulation, is that people in government just do not feel comfortable saying that's a ridiculous complaint. It's so petty. We're not going to do anything about your complaint. Every complaint has to be addressed and considered and sympathized with. Right? And you may say, well, isn't that the way things always were? No. Right? So we are all part of the English legal tradition. Right? So India is still part of the English legal tradition. Right? So around 1200, the law of nuisance was established. This was a law where if your neighbor went and made enormous fires or a very loud noise, you could go and sue them. But there were 2 conditions. One was it had to be extreme. So if you just say, his kids talk too much, get out of here. We're not going to worry about that. And then also, let's see. And then it also had to be a direct complaint about a physical invasion. It had to be smoke is crossing the border, noise is crossing the border. You couldn't sue them just because you thought their house was ugly. All right. And this was the way that the English-speaking world basically worked for these kinds of complaints from neighbors for 700 years. And then around 1900, so no, it's too restrictive. We need to make it easier to complain, and why don't we go and switch it around so that we just assume the complaint is true, and then the owner has to go and rebut the complaint. And also, let's let people go and complain about everything. Let's not limit it to smoke and noise. Let's let people complain about, your house is ugly, or I don't want to live next to apartments. So that was the big change. And that ultimately is what has brought us to where we are, where we're in a world where we are willing to go and destroy trillions of dollars of value for very petty complaints. All right, and then last one. This one I especially notice in my dad, but I think it's common, paranoia. So 35 years ago, there was a major new development that was approved near my house. My dad was so angry. And he said, the city council, they're so corrupt. This is terrible. It's going to ruin our whole neighborhood. And you know what happened? Nothing. Nothing. There was no noticeable change. Nothing bad ever happened. It's a lovely neighborhood. And I think my dad has forgotten he was ever against it. But at the time, he said, this is the end of the world. It's going to be living hell. And I was like, it's going to be fine. Yeah, and I was right. And this is the normal reaction when you start talking about letting people build things, is weaving absurd, extreme scenarios of doom without any probabilities of saying, you know what's going to happen? It's going to be give me a bet. Give me some money if you're wrong, and then we'll talk. All right, so we'll stop here, and let's see, how much time have we got? Yeah, well, so we even officially, we got 8 minutes, and then, like I said, I'm always happy to keep talking. Yes, Jinkia?
Part of the reason why the public opinion is so much against housing regulation is that people.
Well, so much for housing regulation.
So much for housing, sorry. Is that people have so much emotional attachment to a single family home.
Mm-hmm.
They don't like multi-family or mixed use
Mm-hmm.
homes. They have
Hmm.
they're so emotionally
Well, I think that Americans especially are, in terms of political philosophy, are attached to single-family homes. Americans are super willing to buy other stuff if the price is right. So like, I mean, like in general. So I think yesterday I mentioned actions speak louder than words. Yeah, actions speak louder than words. Someone might say, "Oh, single-family homes are the only way to go." Like, well, why do you live there then? Because it's cheaper. Okay, so obviously there is in fact a trade-off between price and quality. And it depends also on where you are in your life. Maybe you would like to have a single family home once you have kids, but before and after you'd like to do something else. So, I mean, that's really the problem, is that when people we're talking about what kind of society do we want to have, that's based on social desirability bias and a philosophy. Whereas, well, how about we see what people will pay money for? That is a much better way of discovering what people actually care about. Yes, please.
So do you think part of the reason why this is especially bad in the US is that there's so much decentralization of power, and so is this one of the negative causes?
Right. That's a very common view, that it's because of decentralization. Well, first of all, I would say that the U.S. appears to be about average for rich countries. We're not, like, England is much worse than us. Like, they're really strangling housing, and I think it is more centralized there. So what I'll say is that the great benefit of decentralization is decentralization always gives variety, and with variety there is hope. So there are parts of the U.S. where regulation is low, and so like Texas, regulation is low, not uniformly low even there. But Texas has had an enormous increase in population in the last 20 years. Why? Because you can build a lot of stuff cheaply in most of Texas, and people are moving there as a result. So if we just had one set of regulations, maybe there would be better regulations for the whole country. Honestly, I would be quite worried that there's going to be bad regulations for the whole country. Some of the most prominent reforms are cases of state governments going and overruling local governments, which I think is great in states that are already terrible. So I'll say, like California, it's already so bad. It's like, let's try anything. like I don't know, like the local governments are screwed up so badly, and I just like hand it to anybody. Like anybody else gonna go and do something different. Let's try it. But the general idea of blaming decentralization, it is a popular story actually, but I'm not so convinced that that's the real problem. And I'll say that decentralization saved me during COVID, right? Because I was in a very strict area of the country, but I was actually I moved to Florida for a month. I was in Texas for 3 months. So like you were actually able to shop around. And by the way, actions speaking louder than words, about 100% of all migration in the United States during COVID was to less regulated states. There's basically almost no one who was living in Texas says, I'm so scared of COVID, I'm going to move to California where they'll protect me. So like nobody like that really. But there's a lot of Californians who are like, I want to live my life, and they move to Texas. Yes, please.
There are actually several areas across India, and specifically a lot of them in Delhi, where a lot of people live, like one of the heaviest populated areas, but they are technically illegal. And when I say a lot of people live there, means a lot of people from various classes, not just poor people. Like a lot of rich people also live there. Is that also a case in the US? Do you have an illegal construction problem?
So yeah, very little. We do have something called homeless encampments, where people who are almost all drug or alcohol addicts will go, like in a very left-wing city, will say the police are not going and arresting us if we go and put tents on the streets. So those are generally illegal, but that would be a very small number of people. They're very visible because they will often be in like historic downtown areas, and they'll have 100 people, but it's a very tiny share. Like the other thing that will happen is that often inside of a house, you will do something illegal. Like you might go and finish your basement illegally, or you might convert a garage into an additional room, and that is done without permits. That's illegal, but it's just based upon the government cannot go and search your house and see what you're doing inside your house. It becomes a problem when you want to sell it. Because when you want to sell it, then it gets discovered, and then it's like, what are we going to do about this? Yes.
Interestingly, you were talking about purchasing exceptions from restrictions. Multiple states in India do allow you to buy additional FSI.
FSI, so you at a fixed public price,
yes,
or
a fixed public price for commercial real estate. They call it purchasing premium floor space index.
All right, and how high is the price?
I'm not sure
Yes.
Yeah, but
Like, is it so exorbitant that it makes you not want to build, or yeah?
commercial builders are
All right.
more than willing to pay that to get 4 additional floors. Say.
All right. All right. So, given that you got the bad law in the books, better to let people buy their way out. I totally agree. There is the fear that they might then deliberately make the law stricter so that they can go and charge more. Although often the system is too dysfunctional to do that. It's just like you just have a system that is, it's not designed by anyone. It's just like so you've heard the saying that a giraffe is a horse designed by committee.
Yeah.
All right, and same idea. People often talk about well, what did the government do? Like, the government is not a person. We're talking about many different agencies spread out over 50 years, just created this horrible mess. I mean, you think about government is kind of like a wiki edited by a bunch of different people who disagree with each other, and then it's just and with no editor, and it's just it just contradicts itself, and what can I even do? It's well, try and see if you can get away with it. Yes, please.
So most of the things that you mentioned here is applicable to
Mhm,
India
mhm.
as well. But I think we have the extra problem of land titling.
Yes, which is the same one he's really talking about. Yes.
Which imposes an extra transaction cost for diligence and litigation. And so where do you think,
Yes.
I'm not able, I know it plays a role somewhere, but I'm not able to piece probably where.
Right. So let's see, what's the best way of putting it? There have been a bunch of different ideas for how to go and title informal real estate. In a way, it's why is it so hard? Because almost all of the original titles that existed in first world countries were originally just customary titles anyway, and then you just say, well, just check what's the custom. I think probably if you were actually willing to just say, look, here's the current occupant, it's verified, we got 3 witnesses, and is that good enough, right? So it's well, couldn't something go wrong? Yeah, but something's terribly wrong already. So it's better just to go and make it easy, even if there's problems with it, than to go and try to make sure that everything works out. So I just say, just making it really easy to do. So, and then once it's done, say, yeah, sorry, tough luck, it can't be challenged anymore, is probably your best bet. Now, by the way, so there's something that I didn't mention, which is true for the US, but even more true for India. So remember, what is the standard argument for why government should go and what government should do if there are negative externalities? Right? Remember yesterday? Tax it, not regulation, tax it. Almost all housing regulation is about stopping housing, which is all, so it's not the right, it's not the approach that would make sense. The approach that makes sense would be to say, look, there's a tax for taller buildings, a tax for multifamily. You can do whatever you want with it, but you have to pay the tax. All right. So anyway, the basic premise of all this regulation, since all of it is trying to reduce construction, is that there are on balance negative externalities of construction. Is that even true? Are there positive externalities of construction that could offset or exceed the negative externalities? It's yeah, totally. So in my book, I talk about how, look, people generally do not want to live in a rural area. In a rural area, you have no traffic problems, no parking problems, no noise, but also you have no movie theaters, no stores, no friends, no one for your kids to play with. There are in fact very large positive externalities of having construction around you, because there are other people that you can interact with. And again, actions speak louder than words. The fact that people pay a large premium to live in urban areas, it shows that for all the problems, they still consider the package of higher density to be positive, not negative. And yet almost all housing regulation is about stopping housing. So if you really appreciated this, it would be we should be, if anything, we should be subsidizing housing and encouraging more, not trying to go and stop it. Now, this is especially true for India, because here, the positive externalities of more construction are especially obvious. All right, you've got people sleeping on the streets. What would happen if there was a much cheaper housing? Probably they would not be sleeping on the streets anymore, right? Do you like seeing people sleep on the streets? Does it make you feel good about your neighborhood to see people sleeping on the streets? You may get used to it, but my guess is you don't feel good about it. You would feel better if they had even a very modest place to live. And if it were cheaper, they would probably not be there. right? Like another one. Um, you've got slums. You take a look at slums, and it's like, well, that's a place for poor people to live. All right, well, what if they could actually own it and then sell out to a developer, right? And then what would replace those slums? A much larger number of housing units. So the slums are actually not a very good way to go and house a lot of people because you're not taking advantage of of the extra floors you could do. So again, like this is one where you would if you deregulated, build a lot of high quality, cheaper housing, you can compensate the people that are already living there, and then you no longer have to look at slums. This is the obvious thing to do with slums, especially in a place like Mumbai where the land is really valuable. If you could only go and let people sell out to developers and build there, the current residents would get a giant benefit, and there'd be a lot more housing, and then people that are going by would no longer look at a slum.
There is a much easier solution, and I would like to add to what Pavitra was saying. One added Indian problem, especially in city, is a big chunk of land within central districts are owned by the government, and which is lying completely surplus and vacant. I think you mentioned this, and I don't think it gets covered in your book.
Yes, so that was actually totally my fault. I can't believe I forgot. But yeah, so about a third of all the land in America is owned by the government. You think of it as a very capitalist country, and actually if you look at a map, half of the country is very capitalist. Because basically, the half of the country that was settled before the rise of the environmental movement, there's almost no government land. The half that was settled after the rise of the environmental movement, there is a large amount of government land on the philosophy it needs to be conserved. And conservation basically means should never be used for the benefit of humans, right? So like, what about national parks? First of all, that is just a very tiny fraction of the land. Most of it is just land. Like there's no national park, there's no nothing. Like maybe you could go and lease it from the government to herd sheep or something. But most of it is just land that is permanently kept off the market by the government. It's just to be conserved for all time to never be used by humans. And also never seen by humans because there's no roads there. You can't do anything there.
We do that in Indian cities.
Yes. Yes.
We do exactly the same in the cities.
We do it
Yes.
within the cities.
And it's not even like a nice park or something.
And there's no conversation about letting that land being used for
Yes.
privately.
So in Mumbai, I went to an urban park where it was like the Rajiv Gandhi Park.
Sanjay Gandhi.
Yeah, or Sanjay Gandhi. And they were saying that some of the tribes live there.
That might be true.
Yes. Again, like another group where the obvious thing is have them own the land and then they can sell out, and like they could definitely use the money, right? Yes, please.
So just on a tangent, because we were discussing the
Mhm.
the geologist, and you talked about how your friend in Texas, right? And he basically increased land value for so many others. There's an argument that the government also does that sometimes when they build public infrastructure. So should the government, as a principle, government be buying more land than what is required to build, say, a metro? Build like basically also acquire land around it, and then once the land value is appreciated, auction it off.
Yeah. In Singapore, that would make sense because the Singaporeans actually do things correctly. Like an actual government, I think it would just wind up being a total disaster, and they'd buy up all this land and evict a bunch of people, and then like 20 years later they haven't even started on the metro line. I mean, that's more like California, but you may have heard about California's how much it costs to not build high-speed rail in California, right? So basically, just the planning alone takes decades and costs billions of dollars, and then it doesn't get built. So, like, if the government actually had common sense and foresight, then sure. But that doesn't describe actual government, so I'd say no. I mean, like, honestly, like, with very rare exceptions, I would say that the best kind of transit is like roads with toll pricing. So the only country that I've seen where mass transit actually works really well, it's not Europe. So basically, if you go to Google Maps for Europe and try different routes, and then compare the transit times for driving versus transit, it is very unusual in Europe that the transit is faster. It's usually, if you're lucky, it's the same, and often it's actually a lot worse. If you want to go to anywhere that is a little bit unusual, then driving is much faster. The only place I know where that is not true is Japan. So in Japan, if you put in alternate routes, driving 10 hours and train 5 hours, and it really works. So it takes a lot of experience in doing a job. Plus, you need really high population density. Now, honestly, you've got that. So maybe like, so here's what I would say. Like maybe if you would go and just let Japan run your rail system, then that would work and work well. It does require swallowing a lot of national pride, but it's that's one of the best things to swallow is national pride. Like as an American, I'm always happy to admit the many failures of America, and I hope I set an example for every other country. Let's all be ready to admit the failures of our own country because we all know how screwed up our own countries are, right? So, and how can anything any better if you say, well, we don't want to admit, like you got to admit, well, like step one is admitting you have a problem. It's just like out.
All Indian
Yeah.
metro systems are actually built in collaboration with Japan.
All right. Huh, all right. All right. Well, all right. So, all right. Well, I'll give you points then. That's yes.
Do you notice, like, for example, in Tokyo, you have Tokyo Osaka metro line, and I'm sure that helps housing of millions of people. So, do you notice a correlation between public metro or public commute projects and the increase in availability of housing?
So, like, it would be amazing if that were not true. I don't know of any actual paper, but obviously, when you go and build like actually functional mass transit, that does raise the value of value real estate around and encourages more building around there.
Like a scenario where you build a metro to nowhere.
Yes.
But since there is connectivity,
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So that that one I think is increased slightly, but yeah, probably not very much because could, but I mean in general, like if you just choose a random location to build a train there, I don't think it's likely to actually do very much.